Hello and welcome to the Sunday Superversive Livestream. A moment, if you will. With planets in his eyes, he turned his head and sang to her of empires filled with joy and dread. Come near, my dove, and taste the hidden love. Into a dream I'll ease you never to wake. One tear to taste, like star milk from above, shows lights unseen unless you dare partake. Sharp on your tongue, a pyramid of snakes uncloaks a dark star burning in my breast. You'll see the world as clearly as the drakes, and capture seas from east to further west. For dragon sight, I'll trade the crystal in your chest. That is part of the projects headed by Rachel Fulton Brown and others to bring something. Well, I know you're not quite part of the movement, Dr. Brown, but very superversive indeed to the spirit of it. Yes, indeed, as our listeners might have guessed, we are talking with the Dr. Rachel Fulton Brown about her Dragon Common Room project, which I have linked into the description and in the chat. And of course, we are joined by Anthony. Hello, Anthony. Uh,
Hello, Ben.
Like,
Hello, Anthony.
hello to you both.
yeah,
Uh,
I made it.
yeah.
I'm
Uh,
I'm happy to be folded into Superversive. I love John C. Wright's Green Knight stories,
oh my
and
goodness, yes.
yes, and so I think you didn't. We're working on Draco Chemicus right now, but we did do our first poem that we did. Centrism Games has a strong Green Knight theme in it, so we're there. Although our Green Knight is a little mischievous.
There's always a bit of fairy around the Green Knight, which I think is always a worthwhile reminder for people, especially if
Mm.
they only know things like the A24 pictures version, which is all right in its own
Is
way.
that the recent movie? I never saw it.
Oh,
I'm just aware of it.
I think it might send antiquarian like you into a frothing rage.
Yeah, I've read enough reviews of it. I think you're right.
If you could you tell us about the Dragon Common Room and break down the project for us?
Sure. So the Dragon Common Room is my internet monastery fencing Saul classroom. And it one day I'm going to figure out an easy way to explain that without having to but it's basically all these crossovers of spiritual training and discipline with language arts, primarily poetry, with the goal of giving us medieval mythological literature that trains your soul. So alchemy, which is where we ended up with Draco Alchemicus, which is our current ongoing project, because it's going to be in series. It's a 5-act poem written modeled on Spencer's Fairy Queen, which, if you don't know Spencer's Fairy Queen, you do know Star Wars, and Star Wars is modeled on Spencer's Fairy Queen. So the quickest way to describe what we're doing is Star Wars meets Shakespeare, which may or may not help people, with the goal. And the superversive goal in this is that, I mean, Spencer, when he's writing Fairy Queen, is trying to give England its own new mythology under Queen Elizabeth, the Protestant Virgin Queen. And so he makes her the Queen of the Fairies in his mythological epic. For Spencer, it's meant to be a series of stories about knights training in virtue and so forth. But of course, he's doing it as against Catholicism very, very powerfully. And so, the monsters, many of the monsters, like the monster in the first book that he writes, the characters meet it almost immediately, and she's this horrible monster that has multiple little children that are all nursing on her and stuff like that. And that's the church, the Catholic Church. And so what we're doing superversively in Draco Alchemicus, among other things, is creating a mythology that's grounded in the ancient tradition and showing the way in which sin has corrupted modernity. I always can keep going, but I usually pause. Just see if there's any questions so far.
You're preaching to the choir.
Well,
Mhm.
that's happy to hear.
We ourselves.
Uh,
Go for it, Anthony.
I was going to say I hate to pick on probably the single least interesting thing that you said, but that admittedly did get my my attention, which is you saying that Star Wars was based on Spencer's Fairy Queen. Now, I know a little bit about the history of Star Wars.
Mm.
I've heard that it was based on Kurosawa's Hidden Fortress. I have heard that it was based on was it Flash Gordon? I don't know, something like that. One of the 50s sci-fi pulps, right? Yeah, and things like that. I
Right.
have never once heard Spencer's Fairy Queen until now. So you piqued my interest. I admit that that is a sidebar of that whole comment, but it caught my attention just because I know a little bit about and even like beyond the myth making. Like for example, I straight up do not believe George Lucas got the idea for Star Wars, like that Joseph Campbell had anything to do with it. I
Oh,
think
I
he made
think
that up.
not. I've never seen that, and that I agree with you. I can prove to you that it's Star Wars in a moment. But the Campbell thing never made any sense.
Yeah, I've
Yeah.
always been convinced that Lucas made that up. Even and to try and give his idea some legitimacy. But Hidden Fortress, I think, is legitimate. Like that, he got it from a Kurosawa film. The plot, and 50 sci-fi pulps. Now, I promise that we'll get back to the really good, important, juicy stuff. But I am very curious about what you're saying with the Fairy Queen.
Well, the thing is, this is actually as important and juicy as everything else because one of the things that we're trying to do is write a story that captures people's imagination at that level. I mean, we have pictures, so we do have the visual element. We don't yet have John Williams, writing symphonic score for us. So, just get us in touch with the right people. We'll make a movie out of it. Um, but that Star Wars has become the mythology for many people now, and that it's the sort of thing that captures your not just your attention, but your life frame, right? That people want to live according to the virtues and the battles and the characters that they see in it. And so we're saying that we want, I mean, the superversive level is obviously we want this to be a Christian story, not I mean, Campbell actually was a Roman Catholic, just lapsed. So his Hero of a Thousand Faces is in fact a Christian model, but everybody denies that. That we're trying to make Christ the true hero of our Draco Alchemicus, and if we could undermine the effect of Star Wars, we would be undermining 500 years of Protestant um, misrepresentation of Catholicism to start with. So that would be great. Right? But let me. So I actually didn't know this about Star Wars until we were putting together stuff for our Kickstarter, and you realize you're trying to figure out what you're doing with Kickstarter. You're trying to say, look, we're doing this like it's written in Elizabethan style poetry, and it's got allegorical figures, and the image of the dragon is actually mirrored on all of these things. It's too hard, right? And we needed some way of pitching it to people, and I was honestly, I'm very honest with where I get my sources, maybe unlike Lucas. I'm looking at the Wikipedia entry right on the Fairy Queen
Mhm.
and reading through the summary and such, and there's this entry reference to a book on trash culture, popular culture and the great tradition by Richard Keller Simon, which came out about almost over 20 years ago, 1999, right? And he has a chapter on Star Wars and the Fairy Queen. And once you read this, you're like, oh my gosh, he's right. That the entire plot structure of A New Hope is based on book one of the Fairy Queen. And it helps if I just go with what he said. So um this, right? It's like Spencer's poem is a long, elaborate, and imaginative sequence of stories or books about the knights of fairyland and their struggles to learn holiness, temperance, chastity, friendship, justice, and courtesy. In the first and most frequently taught book of the Fairy Queen, the part that serves as the basis for Lucas's story, the topic is holiness. The young and inexperienced Red Cross Knight takes up the cause of an innocent woman named Una, fights an evil magician named Archimago, requires the help of a perfect knight named Arthur, learns religious faith from an old hermit named Contemplation, and finally masters holiness, an accomplishment that allows him to destroy the hellish monster that has taken control of Una's land. In Lucas's version of this story, the young and inexperienced Jedi Knight Luke Skywalker takes up the cause of an innocent woman named Princess Leia, fights an evil magician named Darth Vader, acquires the help of a less than perfect fighter named Han Solo, learns religious faith from two old hermits named Obi-Wan Kenobi and Yoda, and finally masters the Force, an accomplishment that allows him to destroy the evil empire, the hellish monster that has taken control of Leia's republic. There are many stories about knights and evil magicians and monsters, and Lucas has acknowledged reading The Hero with a Thousand Faces, Joseph Campbell's analysis of the cultural monomyth, about the adventures of a hero who ventures into a land of fantasy and danger. But although Lucas does borrow some ideas from Campbell, along with specific incidents and imagery from The Wizard of Oz and Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, it is book one of The Fairy Queen that Lucas mines for most of his story. Almost everything of importance that we see in the Star Wars movies has its origin in the Fairy Queen, from small details of weaponry and dress to large issues of chivalry and spirituality. A dazzlingly bright light shield represents the special force of Christian spirituality in the Fairy Queen, just as a special effects lightsaber represents a similar spiritual force in Star Wars. Both are instrumental in the battle against evil. A powerful lion protects Una and represents the natural world in Spencer, just as a lion like humanoid named Chewbacca protects Luke and Leia and represents the natural world in Lucas. Una wears white and is accompanied by a dwarf, just as Leia wears white and is accompanied by two androids, C3PO and R2D2. And just as Una's dwarf gathers up weapons, gives directions and information when he can, and functions as a servant, C3PO and R2D2 do the same. There are numerous figures of darkness and night in Spencer, all dressed in black and associated with hell. And Lucas, Darth Vader, and the evil Emperor dressed in black and associated with the Death Star. Red Cross wears the image of the cross at the beginning of his story, and Luke gains what appears to be a clerical collar near the end of his, and so forth. It goes on and on and on. It's like the actual cast of characters, the details of the battles, the feeling of mystery and mythology. All of it is straight out of Spencer.
That's pretty interesting. One of the things in the middle of all of that analysis, one of the things that occurs to me that I think is important to bring up, because it's people think it's been like this forever, and it's not. It's actually like a relatively recent phenomenon, probably started in like the mid '90s or so. Is the separation of high art from pop culture.
Hmm.
Like, that was not, we think of it as two separate things. And, like, to be clear, even in America, like, that wasn't the case. Like, even now, like, we think, oh, well, maybe it wasn't in, like, ancient Greece or whatever. But no, even in America, like, you talk about what was the best film. The Oscars are a really good example to track the downfall of this, because people would go, like, what people thought were the best films of the year, what audiences watched, used to be the films that won the Oscars. And that stopped being the case. Or probably after, like, Titanic or so. Uh, and it's really interesting to me, right? Because it got so bad to the point that the Oscars eventually had to create a new category, because it became so plainly obvious to everyone that what was winning awards was not what people cared about or were watching. So they
Hmm.
created like a mainstream movies category.
It
Yeah.
tells you I didn't know that because I haven't watched the Oscars in
Oh, I don't watch
decades.
them. I just remember the story coming up, right? Like,
Yeah.
I have no idea what any of the winners are, but I know that this was a thing that had to happen, because it became like so clear. But if you talk to people who they used to be like, yeah, the Oscars were a big event, people cared about it, it was a big deal, because the movies that were winning were movies that we saw, and we would root for certain, movies and things to win. Uh, there's a theory of like cultural decline, and starting in the '90s, that goes around our little superversive circle. There's this idea of like culture peaked in the mid '90s or so,
Mm.
or more accurately, had it peaked in the '80s and had a bit of a dead cat bounce in the '90s. And then there's been like a steady decline since then. And I think that it's interesting, because you could sort of track this with the Oscars with like Titanic. And also, as John C. Wright, in fact, has pointed out, in Beauty and the Beast not winning the Oscar the year that it came out, John has always pointed at it was nominated famously. It was an animated movie that got nominated for Best Picture,
Hmm.
and it sort of indirectly led to the creation of the Best Animated Picture Oscar. But he said it should have won Best Picture at the Oscars. Like, it was better than any movie that had come out that year. So all of this is to say that I think what you're saying, it is important that we point out that when we talk about, high art from the past and modern art being influenced by it, we're not talking about something separate from pop culture.
Oh, absolutely, I agree. And that's so the puzzle about this is, which Simon in his case study doesn't go into, although I haven't read his old book. I just read this chapter, so I'm not sure, but it's likely that I mean, Lucas could have read Spencer. It's also possible that what he had access to, you're saying he had other movies that he was modeling things on and so forth, that Spencer's Fairy Queen was very popularly illustrated in the 19th century, and sort of children's versions of it. So it could be that what Lucas had was a kind of plot structure that he got from those versions of Spencer. And when I was, not when I was growing up so much, but growing up, I had a great love for a particular children's illustrator, Trina Shard Hyman, who I knew. I mean, this dates me because she was I mean, everything dates me, but she was the founding art editor for Cricket Magazine, children's magazine, and she did illustrations for that. And I just loved her work. She did a version of this book one of the Spencer's Fairy Queen, but it's the Knight and the Dragon, or Saint George and the Dragon, right? It's like knight fighting dragon. Spencer's description of the dragon battle in book one is amazing, right? And it's like prototypical now for, I think, all great dragon fights. All of that is very, very popular in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And so, like the fairy tales, like Grimm's fairy tales, Spencer has a he's not only Elizabethan, right? There's layers of the interest in these kinds of stories that Lucas was clearly building on with Star Wars. But it is interesting, as you're saying, Anthony, that it's since a certain time, draw a line at some point, right? During my lifetime, apparently all of this just drops out, and everybody forgets it, and you don't have Bugs Bunny singing opera anymore,
Hmm.
right? Right. You're not allowed to have these sort of cultural references across culture. And the thing is, the other thing I'll say, to flip this back over in superversive way, high culture and low culture are not meant to be separable in a Christian context. It's in this I've you know done some blog post on Fencing Barrett Prayer about the layers of interpretation that we have playing through our poetry work. One of them, very importantly, is Augustine's insistence that Christian preaching takes on the highest, most sublime topic, salvation, and does it in a, quote, low, comedic style, right? In the lowbrow sermo humilis, that Christ becomes incarnate, enters into our world, into our story, to speak with us in our ordinary human language, and that Christianity is always speaking to the simple of the highest things, right? And so that crossover of divine mythology and ordinary life is typical and necessary for the understanding of the incarnation.
Hmm.
Absolutely.
It's Yeah, cosine.
Let's see how, if you don't mind, let's walk through your Dragon Common Room and take a look at what we have. What you have to to show us. Like the big things here is Aurora Borealis, Draco Alchemicus, Mosaic Art,
Hmm.
and of course you have a merch shop.
We do. Everybody needs to check out the Sky Clock video on the merch, where we're putting together the puzzle from Aurora Borealis. It's beautiful. So we've, the in all of these ways, we're trying to do like monastic education, which has to happen for both children and the adults. It needs to happen both in, sort of beautiful forms for performing the praise of God, and also the simple forms that I've been talking about just now for children. And so our work is, for all ages, quite literally, but in different categories. So Aurora Borealis is a children's story, and the easiest way to get into that one is to understand it as a Grail quest. That the bears in the story are in the North Pole, and um, the polar bear's friend, the albatross, comes and tells them there's lights down south, and the polar bear gets captured or netted by three fishing bears, and he says, "Come with me. We'll go find the light in the south." And they travel off, and we do have a map that's at the back of the end of the book that shows you the sort of whimsical landscape that they're going through. That it's modeled on a medieval map mundi where Jerusalem is at the center of the map and the paradise is on the outer side. And our bears go from the center, the North Pole, to the edge, the South Pole. So you could say it's a flat Earth journey, but it's also a spiritual journey from Jerusalem to paradise, as it were, from the holy city to the earthly paradise. But on the way, they rescue a panda from some mean seals who have been teasing him. The panda becomes very important because he's kind of the mystical creature in the story. They go to Antarctica. They find the penguins who have various rituals that they've been practicing, but they don't have the fullness of the mystery. And when the panda eating the offerings on the altar gets seized by the griffin, the bears have to rescue him again. But that has a little different outcome from the first one. It's meant to be a story that kids really like. I've read it to kids at St. John Cantius Church here in Chicago, and they seem to want me to keep going. Uh, that it's meant to show the mystery of the participation in the liturgy and the mystery of the sacraments, but in a way that is like this adventure of discovery for the children reading the story. You can get it on the website. There's some coloring pages that you can also play with. The book is published in black and white. All of its characters are black and white because these animals are right, polar bears and orca whales and penguins and such. But the hand-drawn bear now, Colleen, did some versions of the pictures so that you can color them in as well. So that's what Aurora Borealis is. It's a children's story.
Wonderful.
I
Even though it's, I don't know, I'm just getting the feeling that it might be a little Catholic. It is
No, no, no.
certain.
Hey, we are very ecumenical because one of our writers is Coptic Orthodox, and another of our writers is Maronite, although that's Catholic. Some of us are Catholics. In the Aurora Borealis team, we had a Mormon. So, no, what we're trying to show you is Christ,
Yes.
and through the liturgy and through the participation in the sacraments. But I'm coming to Catholicism from the Middle Ages, which means a lot of modern Catholic discussion doesn't always make terrific much sense to me because it's post-Reformation. We're trying to show the sort of medieval level of symbolic associations and storytelling that I really, from my own recent experience becoming Catholic 5 years ago, is missing in modern Catholicism.
From what I've seen from services I've had with friends and such in this movement, I absolutely agree. Um, it's having somebody sort of wave their hands and go, "Ooh, look at the meaning," uh, has never has never done anything for me because I can read the meaning for myself from my sweet, sweet sola scriptura, my beloved. Uh, so it's having meaning, deep meaning that is always there for the person to reach out and touch to understand in a deeper manner is incredibly important. I would be a absolute neckbeard of an atheist if my dad hadn't sat me down and taught me how to interpret the scripture, how to read scripture for myself, how to sort of dissolve my ego from what I want to read and into, sort of what God has for us. And in that same way, whenever I see uh, a knight bowing at the altar, I don't see, more Catholicism. I'm feeling itchy, but rather I see somebody who is submitting to God before the eve of battle to do His will, to fight, the good fight, to slay the dragon, and not, and not, shall we say, get into arguments with internet atheists. I'm of the St. Louis school, you see.
Well, I was born in St. Louis, and I don't know what that means.
Oh,
What
he
do
has
you
a
mean?
he has a he has
You
a
mean San Louis?
Saint Louis. Uh, he has a famous quote where he says you must stab the blasphemer rather than
Oh yeah,
argue
well
him.
Joinville tells that story. Yeah, yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
very good.
Well, so this is, I mean, I'd say I'm a new Catholic in the sense that I, was confirmed in 2017, but I grew up Presbyterian, and all of my scholarly work is on reading scripture, in the medieval mode, right, which is something that Calvin was actually quite familiar with
Mm.
in his institutes, right? That I sort of say it's like if you study Calvin properly, you end up a medievalist. Because he's when if you're familiar with the institutes, he quotes from Bernard of Clairvaux's sermons on the Song of Songs a lot, and
Mm.
he was specifically upset with the scholastics of the universities of the late 15th and early 16th century, who he says had hidden all of the truth of the mysteries in their archives or libraries, and that he had rediscovered them. And what he rediscovers is, in fact, the kind of monastic exegesis that I work on, and trying to show how people imagined that their access to the mysteries through those texts. So you're already there. You're already there. And
Yeah.
the thing, Aurora Borealis is it's meant to be. I mean, it's meant to be fun too. It's like if I'm reading it to 10-year-olds, they better like have a few fist fights and stuff to when the bears bop the seals on the nose and the seals go flying. Right? It's the kids love that. So it's how do we do what Augustine said, which was you're delighting as well as instructing when you're showing what God has for us, because we're His children, right? It's like it should be
Absolutely.
stories that like parables.
Yeah, I will say, so I'm Catholic. Ben's not, I am.
What?
We have had like Protestant, yeah, yeah. We've had like what we have called I don't know if we ever settled on an official name, but something like Protestant versus Catholic streams, where what we would do is both neither of us are very interested in debating the other, both because we don't want to we just don't want to fight with each other. I think at least that's my perspective. Who knows what Ben's thinking? But his mind's a mystery. Uh, but I just don't want to get into like an argument with my friend, and also I'm frankly worried that in a debate I will get trounced, and I'm like, that doesn't seem like that would be helpful for anyone. So instead, we
This
set
is
it up in a
prudent.
yep. So instead, we set it up in a way where we each get like between 40 minutes and an hour or so to talk about a particular topic. And then at the end of it, we'll have a few minutes of discussion together about what we've both just said without interrupting the other, which I think has actually been a helpful format for people. They get a Protestant Catholic perspective, uninterrupted, side by side, so that you can decide for yourself which sounds more plausible to you or what you want to research more likely. Hopefully, you weren't making the decision based on this one discussion between two schmucks on the internet, but help you decide where you're gonna continue your research or whatever. But one thing that does strike me about both me and Ben is that while we absolutely have on certain subjects very strong and irreconcilable differences, and I say irreconcilable in the sense that if they were reconciled, either he would be Catholic or I would be Protestant.
Yep.
So, by definition, they are not reconcilable. Uh, we also are both on the side of the less extreme ends, I think, of both of our faith traditions. Like, I have spoken to like radical Catholics who you have just said that you think that like reading Calvin makes you a medievalist and things like that. Like, I have spoken to radical Catholics where if you were to say that to them, they might kick you out of the group because you said something vaguely positive about Calvin, uh, and they
Hey,
hate
this
Calvin.
is this is this is my benefit of being a woman. Um, And therefore, no, it's like if I, you guys have to work stuff out in your hierarchies and stuff like that. Women don't belong in your hierarchies. I listen to Vox enough. um and um
Ha.
and two, that this monastic tradition is something that I think neither modern variant of the church has, they're obviously monastic revivals in the 19th century and so forth, but I went from growing up Presbyterian, knowing that the scriptures mattered, to graduate school wanting to study, the liturgy of the church and the way they use scripture to talk about, Mary, right? So I kind of did an end run round, and I only came back to, was listening to Calvin after I'd been, studying the Middle Ages for ages. And when he started talking about Bernard of Clairvaux, and I'm like, well, oh, this makes sense, right? He's upset with, and Luther was upset with some of these things too. That he's, one, everybody knows how this happens, right? That you have a tradition that starts adding stuff on, right? Because
Yep.
people, have another day that they like to celebrate, or this other, exercise that they find useful, and before you know it, you can't move for traditions. um Luther actually was an Augustinian friar before he was a university professor, and he learned all of the liturgy. He was very, very good at it, but over scrupulous, and so he kind of threw out the baby with the bathwater and saying, "Oh, we don't need all of that regular practice. We just, experience faith immediately." As a historian, I'm always interested in how do people get to that answer, right? Where are they starting from with the problem that was the answer to? And unfortunately, what
Hmm.
most people do when they come into, you know anything, is they're looking for the answers rather than the reason that the answers are what they're not looking for the questions that the things are answers to,
Yep.
if that makes sense.
There.
Yeah, there's a really great discussion between Dr. Brett Salkeld and Gavin Ortland on YouTube somewhere. So Gavin
Mm.
Ortland is a well-known Protestant apologist. He famously did a debate a few months ago with Trent Horn on Sola Scriptura. That's really interesting to watch. And Dr. Brett Salkeld he's a scholar who has a particular expertise on the Eucharist, and they had a discussion on the Eucharist. And one of the fascinating things about that discussion was Salkeld was pointing out in the discussion. He's a pretty ecumenical guy, or orthodox, I think, lowercase
Mm.
o, but ecumenical guy. And he was pointing out that Calvin, Luther, and Saint Thomas Aquinas, I mean, were all trying to solve the same problem with the Eucharist, essentially, and they were all coming up with like various answers to it. Now, he says, I do think that St. Thomas came to the best
Mm-hmm.
solution of the three of them. He goes, but I think that we would be doing a disservice not to point out that all of them have accurately identified the problem, which is how do you make sense of the Eucharist? He even says, he argues that Calvin believed in the real presence, and he said he believed in a spiritual real presence, and he goes, every time Catholics hear that, they say, so he doesn't believe in the real presence, to which I would respond, God is a spirit. Do you not believe in God because you
Right.
think he's
Yeah.
spiritual? He goes, so I don't agree with. He goes, Calvin is trying to solve the same problem that Thomas is trying to solve. He comes up with his own solution and goes, and I think it has issues, but I think he did accurately see the problem. Luther as well. I think that Luther's thing, it goes back to Luther's whole his consubstantiation, which I don't think is what he would have called it, but his consubstantiation, I think, goes back to Luther's whole thing about, like, obviously the bread and wine are still there. You could say it's not there, but I'm looking at it, I can feel it, I can taste it. So say what you want. There is bread and wine here, is how Luther, I think, thought of the matter, which is why he's like, but Christ's real presence is also here, you know. And Thomas is saying that it's not there at all. The bread and wine are just gone. It's something completely different. And Calvin is like, well, the God is present, but spiritually. But they're all trying to solve the same problems. Now time goes on, and then there's Ulrich Zwingli on the side going, it's just a symbol. Uh,
No, and the thing is, what you're saying is
but
absolutely accurate, and that's why this is actually nice to be able to talk about this, because if you can set it up as what was the question, and then you see this array of answers. And one of the things that's happening, and this is we're well off topic on Draco Chemicus, but also we are actually on topic on Aurora Borealis as the mystery. Um, Many of these debates were already part of the tradition from the 12th century, when things like transubstantiation were just being articulated as the way to describe the answer. So I know scholarship. Gary Macy is one of the medievalists that's worked a lot on these questions, who's shown that even in the 12th century there are people that say, oh well, it's a spiritual reality, or oh, it's more a community. The church becomes present as the body of Christ. It's like these are things that over the centuries people mull over and are in contemplation of. And that for me is, as both a scholar and a storyteller and a historian and a Christian, right, are we going to come up with the absolutely right answer? Probably not. So that I do think in the Catholic tradition, at least the deep long medieval Catholic, you start with the way we worship, and then other questions arise about why do we do it this way and what does that mean. But the sort of practice of praising God should be central.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I know too. Like Jimmy, even when you go to things like Sola Fide, Jimmy Aiken pointed out in a conversation with a Lutheran, Dr. Cooper, Jordan Cooper, I think. In a conversation with a Lutheran, he pointed out in response to, and Jimmy Aiken's a Catholic apologist, in response to a viewer question, that the terminology of faith alone really originated with Aquinas
Yeah,
in
right,
some of his
exactly.
commentaries.
So
He's
so
like,
these
because somebody goes, "Why did Luther invent faith alone?" And Jimmy Aiken goes, "I'll answer that. It actually originated in Aquinas." So
that
he's
that
like,
makes sense. Yeah. Yeah. So you see, this is why it's good that you and Ben don't argue these things out, because there's not really an argument at the level that people worry that there is, right? It's
Yep.
like, well, we'll lose salvation if we don't come down on the right definition here. And so this is actually a very good frame for what we're trying to do in Dragon Common Room, which is, you know, give people stories to imagine the mysteries through, that then raise questions that pose it as parables and riddles rather than as theological definitions.
And that's a good way to reach children. Since,
Right.
like, quite frankly, I was a very intelligent kid. I could read the Bible and say, this has a meaning. But not everyone can reach out to something, humble themselves, especially as a kid, and say, I know there's a meaning to this. I do not know the meaning. Therefore, I need somebody to hold my hand and, sort of bring me to that. Having it through stories and parables is a time honored and medieval tradition.
Well, and Christian, that's
biblical.
what Jesus did.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yes.
So that if you want to have these theological answers, for the most part Jesus was dealing with people that were trying to get him to give clear definitions on punishment and well, if this happens and that happens, then exactly what there, and he
Mm.
tends to overturn it and then tell a parable that we're still wrestling with 2000 years later to understand the full depth of, like, the so I have on Dragon Common Room, there are various pages on the website, and one of the new ones that I just added is this occasional verse that you can find through the homepage. We've To write these poems, and I can say a little bit about why poetry, right? That poetry is the way in which we shape our thoughts. And what's interesting is, like, we've all gone dialectical. Thanks to the scholastics, everybody thinks that knowing something requires syllogisms and proofs and things. Ancient thinking also includes, obviously, poetry, right? All of the great ancient literature is in poetry, and that stories are ways in which we come to understand mysteries that are, I don't think, accessible through logic. I think a lot of what we experience as human beings is more real through myth and story. I mean, Star Wars, for example, right? It's like, why do we keep going back to Star Wars? Because it's not just archetypes, it's structures of interaction and reference and rhyme, right, as it will. Poetry, to write it, takes attention to language on all levels, right? It's sound, it's beat through time, so the meter, it's very specific choices of words so that, one, they sound right together, but also they blend together in the meaning. I like describing each of the stanzas that we write. It's like making a jewel, that everything
Mm.
has to fit exactly right. But it's also like doing a Sudoku puzzle with the numbers. All of the
Mm-hmm.
meter has to fit. All of the, there has to be the right number of syllables. All of these things have to fit perfectly, and it's like solving a beautiful puzzle once we lock a stanza, because everything fits, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and to get that, we hope we're getting better. We our older stuff, we keep looking and saying, oh golly, that doesn't right, that doesn't scan. We're getting better at feeling the rhythm and putting everything in the right place, and so it's an actual like trainable skill, which is one of the things I'm interested in. But we've done a lot of practice poems, and on the occasional verse, I have some of our practice poems, some of our promotional stanzas, and um, you can get a feel just for how things have to fit together correctly, from all that. I launched into that, and I can't remember why. I was trying to say why we need the poetry, because it's like, so there's a poem that I wrote way back 15 years ago, when I was first really starting to think about, like, how can I get into this understanding of verse, and it's on the image of a pearl, right? The poem is called "A Pearl of Great Price," and it's meditating on the difference between poetry and prose, based on a paper that I had just read that afternoon about the image of a pearl in medieval symbolism. And the problem with the image of the pearl in medieval symbolism is that in the Middle Ages, from antiquity, they don't think pearls are made with, well, it's not grit pieces of grit. It's actually little animals that fall into the oyster, but never mind. They don't think it's that. They think it's drops of heaven. They think it's dew, that the oysters open up and they get a drop of heaven, and then that forms the pearl. And so when they look at pearls as gemstones, they understand that they're alive, but they also think of them as drops of heaven. And the meditation in my poem on A Pearl of Great Price is how poetry changed once the science changed of pearls, because now, instead of thinking that pearls are drops of heaven, we think they're the oyster, enveloping. I say, the oyster's self-protection against invasion, excretions of nacreous goo are hardly the stuff of poetry. So, poetry has to work on all of these levels, not just, prettiness and sound and such, but also knowledge. And all of that doesn't happen when you're worrying in a syllogism about what transubstantiation means.
Yep.
It's funny. It's funny because you say hardly the stuff of poetry, and my first thought was G.K. Chesterton in The Man Who Was Thursday, and his little sermon in the book on the poetry of the train line, and how the most poetic thing in the world is a train schedule. And I'm also thinking there
I
was an
love
argument I
Chesterton. He's
saw.
really good at that. So,
Yeah,
yes.
there was an argument I saw that was that's always remained vivid in my mind because it was so fascinating to me, of somebody arguing that like poetry, that beauty had to do with like symmetry and sight and beauty, and somebody was saying like, no, that's ridiculous, and you would say that the dung beetle was beautiful,
Mm.
and somebody on goes, do you know what a scarab beetle is in Egypt? It's like, you probably don't, right? It's like, that is a dung beetle. It's like, so to answer your question, yes, there was
Hey,
a
I wrote a poem
society of
about it.
yeah, there was a society of people that absolutely believed that the dung beetle was not just beautiful, but one of the pinnacles of beauty that like structured many works of art around the dung beetle. Uh, so you say that with the oyster, but it makes me think of those two things of and going like, well, why can't the pearl be poetic, right? I'm sure that Chesterton could write a lovely poem on the creation of the pearl from the goo of the oyster.
Of course he could, and I did too. And you're proving my point.
Yep.
Yeah, so that, right, and that we're it has to be poetry because it has to work on these various levels. It needs to be, I mean, stories, because they're like parables. And to say, Jesus, when he's trying to describe the kingdom of heaven, that's where the pearl of great price came from, right? It's from the parable where it's like, what would the merchant give if he found a pearl in the field, and he would give the whole field to dig it up and find it. That we are trying to recover. And what's funny is it's like we start with Star Wars. Star Wars has these layers, right? I think that's why I grew up with Star Wars. I saw it in the theater when it first opened, right? Um, or A New Hope, I did. That Why don't we have this level of storytelling now? The Superversives recognize that we should
Hmm.
in that project.
Absolutely.
So I should tell you about
Yeah.
Draco Chemicus.
Yes, absolutely. I think at some point we need to schedule another one after this in the future and just talk in general. I think we'd enjoy it.
Oh, that would be fun. That would be fun. So with Draco Chemicus, so that the Bear Aurora Borealis was for the kids, and it was originally, when Bertaria was trying to do bear stories and such. So we got the bear imagery. Although I'm fencing bear from way before Owen was anything big bear, so fencing bear is authentic. Um, the Draco Chemicus came out of really the frustration that we had with um, the COVID stuff
Mm.
and the way that people were being bespelled into believing things that about medicine and science. And we were also it also came when I was funnily enough reading one of Jay Dyer's books on Hollywood and got to a passage where he's talking about Dune, and then Dune came out, and it was like suddenly I was just all of the things came together about spice and the importance of the drug trade. All of this folded into then thinking about the way in which we've been um, magicked over the modernity, right, since the 16th century, into believing the claims of, and science and magic are the same thing in this twinning, right? Draco Alchemicus is like that's the scientific name that you'd have for the like Homo sapiens, Draco Alchemicus, right? It's the dragon, the alchemical dragon, but it also is meant to recall, alchemy as magic, right? So we're constantly looking one way or the other for science to save us or magic spells to whisk us away into power. And the problem is that that's a lie. Right? The dragon lies to us. The spices and drugs are simply addictive. And here we are all in this city of light. And then with Draco Chemicus, we're playing off of time travel and such, right? That we're going from the Elizabethan period through the 17th and 18th century Enlightenment, through the 19th century steampunk into the present, although it's not in order like that. They go back and forth. Um, in that sort of time travel, that all is happening now in the internet. So the opening of the pitch for it is a dragon slayer's entered the city of light. In the great mosaic of glass and light, a dragon rules a merchant empire. The ships carry every treasure, metal, oils, and precious stones to his hoard, but nothing is more precious to the dragon than spice. And that verse that you read at the beginning, Ben, is the sort of description of what the dragon is. He's promising you dragon sight, right? Your ability to knowledge, right? It's like
Mm-hmm.
Satan. In exchange for the crystal in your chest, which is your soul, your own life, and that temptation of addiction and knowledge is the thing that's enslaved humanity. Well, how do you fight that, right? How are we going to overcome that level of spell casting? Well, there's obviously only one answer. And what's interesting is in the dragon, the Draco, right? Draco in Latin is dragon, but it's also serpent.
Mm-hmm.
So the antidote to the dragon spice is obviously the brazen serpent. And if you look at the website on the actual Draco Chemicus page, you'll see a sort of scan over the gate picture. We have our hero at the bottom with his pigeon on his shoulder, and it pans up to the dragon looking at himself in this crystal spire. That the twinning and the mirroring is really important. That Christ enters into our incarnate world, into this city of light, to battle the dragon, but that he is the actual medicine, right? The Draco Chemicus is either the satanic ensorceling dragon, or in fact Christ, who is lifted up as the brazen serpent to be the antidote.
Mm.
So we say sin like snake oil is a hell of a drug, but who is the antidote to that? And we've for the Kickstarter, we did a Kickstarter to help raise money to pay our artist, because this is a Aurora Borealis hand drawn bear illustrated it as part of our team and for the bear community. With Draco Chemicus, I was contacted by a young man who does Catholic comics. That's his website, Catholic Comics, and he's a Portuguese comic artist. He did the the sort of various layers of community we're talking to now. Zay illustrated a biography of Marcus Aurelius he was the illustrator for it. It was a academic who studies Stoicism who did the text. But then he said, "No, I need to do Catholic. I need to do Christian stories now." And he found me through some blog posts that I'd done on why comics are an incarnational Christian art. And he's like, "Oh, you've given me like you said what I'm doing in this Christian art." And I said, "You're drawing dragons for us." So the Kickstarter was to help pay him for his artwork, but we also did a sort of as a top upper tier um, donor reward, some decks of cards that he did two different backs for. One is the alchemical dragon, the globe dragon, the dragon of science and magic and power, and the other one's the brazen serpent. And it's like both of them are the Draco Alchemicus. Both of them are the one's medicine, one's cure. Which one's poison, which one's cure. So that's the setup, and then I haven't told you the story yet at all, but that's that's the sort of frame problem of our addiction and what it is to be captured in the world by Satan.
And what a frame it is. It's absolutely wonderful, in
Thank
all
you.
the best ways. Especially since it's hard for people to understand just how much we're dependent on the enemy for a lot of our things in our lives, and having his sort of tactics, having what makes a ticket, shall we say, out in the open is only good for us, as it prevents people from being deceived as easily.
That is exactly what we want to show in this poem. We've said we've tried out various taglines to show that it's like learn to discern is one of them, to say that this is how do you tell the difference between the Draco Chemicus that's the scientific temptation and the Draco Chemicus that's our savior.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, and that the story is meant to show the way in which um, we come under the influence of like literal influencers, and we introduce those in the first act, like the influencers that are going to be themselves part of the test. They get caught up in a game show kind of setting. And but we also we show the fall, the couple that we have in our you go to our website and you get invited to join our email list. Please join our email list. You'll get treats. um they're the man and the woman are making their bets, and they're actually betting on in a casino on a horse race. And our temptress shows up and makes them an offer, which they don't refuse. So at all levels, it's like with the bears, we're trying to show Aurora Borealis, we're trying to show the mysteries of the layers of ritual and participation in the Eucharist. In Draco Chemicus, we're trying to show the mechanism of sin. I've left you speechless.
Excuse me. I there were emergency services charging up my lane, and I had to turn off my mic. Uh, no, it's I like it. There's parallels across things. You can look at other Christian books and novels, and you can see different ways that the enemy works. In this case, temptation is the classic. It works all the time. Show me what was I think it's Malvolio who says, show me the man, I'll show you the crime.
Hmm.
That's whole story. Which one is it? Twelfth Night is entirely about people just lusting after each other and getting into wacky circumstances to try and win each other's heart, quote unquote. He Malvolio himself is tormented by uh, the servants of his master into wearing ridiculous garb and freaking her out, um, and so on and so forth. it is throughout the Bible. It's throughout the literature of Christians. The devil is, a tempter.
Well, and this is I so you all said that the Forge of Tolkien on unauthorized. That Tolkien says it's like there's no human story without a fall, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
basically the situation. And that I mean, obviously it's so powerful. It is the story that we're constantly caught up in. The Lord of the
Mm-hmm.
Rings is another example of how, trying to show what it's like to come under the sway of that kind of um well, it's so I think the ring is different. It's addiction, but it's a addiction of a media sort is what I've been arguing this last year. That when I spent a lot of time reading Marshall McLuhan and thinking about the effects of media, which fit with the dragon too, because he's storytelling, right? That's a media effect. But
Mm.
Sauron seems to be functioning very much like the way McLuhan describes the radio. And if you think about the way power flowed in the 20s and 30s and into the 40s, it's the radio. It's the radio that gave people power to be swayed and their wills taken over and such. So I did a video for Mosaic Arc. That was a solo. I've only done a couple solo, but that one I did solo, and it was on Sauron's mic, right? It's a giant the tower Barad-dûr is a giant radio tower.
Nice.
I do make this case in the in that episode.
It's a
Yeah, I think Tolkien's response to something like that would probably be to vociferously deny that it was meant to be any one thing, knowing his attitude towards such attempts.
Yes, I
But
know.
so I think that I think he would very vociferously deny that it was meant to represent something like technology. With that said, Tolkien was famously averse to technology. There's
No, that he wasn't. He imagined a typewriter with Fëanorian script on it. He wrote a little book about Mr. Bliss in his car. He actually liked technology.
there's the story of him though getting the recorder, and the first thing he does when he speaks into it is say the Lord's Prayer in Latin to exercise the recorder. Uh,
Well,
so
that's fine because he's not wrong. Right? It's like and that's it's like with the Draco Chemicus. I mean, so Act One we set in the casino, and it's like sort of the gamble, the way in which everything in the world now is caught up in these you want certainty on your gambling. Basically, is our frame there. Act Two, which we're writing now, is set in a tea party, right? So there's sort of shades of both Alice in Wonderland and Elizabeth in her fairy queen character, and they're all going to be telling stories. And the thing about the storytelling is, like I said, I'm not joking when I say it's a media. It's a stories are spells, right? And guess what? The best story is, oh, God's spell, right? That gospel basically just means good story, right? So it's
yep.
it's the good story. And what Tolkien understood was that power of language and storytelling. And so that I think actually Sauron, I've read other people's, I know I'm familiar with D. Michael Jones's argument that it's usury and gold and stuff. I think it actually makes more sense to be it's the power of story, because that is fundamentally what Tolkien was out about, right? Fairy stories and how powerful they are.
I could believe it. It's always telling a story to the whoever has it at the time. Hey, you could have X, Y, Z, whatever your heart's desire is, and this is how you
Precisely.
do it.
It's story, it's advertising.
yeah, there's I once read what I thought was a pretty compelling argument about Sauron. I don't think it was like a scholar that said it. I literally think it was just a fan talking about it. But I remember the argument was interesting enough to me that I remember it probably years later now. And they were making the argument that Sauron in the Lord of the Rings was somebody who was almost an artist, a creator,
Mm.
right? And that the corruption of Sauron was that Sauron believed that he could build better than the other Aenir, that he was the master builder, right, and
Morgoth.
creator and of. the Aner.
Melkor would be,
So
yeah. No, but that makes sense. That works.
Mm.
and
Yeah.
they said that so Sauron, one of the I'm going to hesitate calling it problems, so imagine that I'm making air quotes. One of the problems with the Lord of the Rings is that you don't get much of a sense of Sauron besides the fact that he is very evil. So a lot of the things that you need to draw out about him are from other material. Now, and some of it not even published properly or published after his death, like, things like that, right? Uh, it is true, though, that when you read The Lord of the Rings, this is why people have this image of Sauron as just like big bad evil guy. Well, because if you read The Lord of the Rings, that is all you get of Sauron. You get that Mordor is very, very evil. There is no real reason given for why Mordor is very, very evil. There are hints of it, like Tolkien. That's the thing about the Lord of the Rings. One of the things that makes it so brilliant is that Tolkien did plan this world, so you get the sense that even when something is not there, it isn't random, and there is a story that you missed out on, and you just didn't get the full sense of. And with Tolkien, you're probably right. So I don't really mean this as a full criticism because you very much get that sense of like, history in the Lord of the Rings as you read it. But I will say that as far as, criticisms go, it is true in the Lord of the Rings that Sauron is as a villain is just sort of there. He is evil and we hate him because he is evil. Uh you never really learn how he turned evil, why he is evil, what his story is. That's all from like the Silmarillion and the Unfinished Tales and things like that. Uh, and of course, as any Tolkien fan worth their salt will tell you, Sauron, that guy's nothing. Child's play compared to Morgoth. Uh, the all the hipster Tolkien fans out in the background going, Sauron, idiot.
Well, if you all subscribe to unauthorized, so one of the things, if you subscribe to our newsletter for the Dragon Common Room, we're sending out exclusive content. One of which is putting up some of my episodes from the Forge of Tolkien onto a private YouTube list, so you can watch some of. And we posted my intro one on what kind of stories we've fallen into. I I'm not sure I'm going to put up the whole thing. I haven't decided yet, but I done episodes in the Forge of Tolkien on a lot of this. And Anthony, one of the things you're pointing to is, of course, the story of Beren and Luthien, which is where
Hmm.
Sauron is actually, you know, there as the werewolf, that the lieutenant of Morgoth, right? I didn't when in the Forge of Tolkien. I only got through Gondolin right at the at the end of the sort of the wars of Gondolin, and I need one day I need to get back and do the Second Age, and then the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings. But I did a lot of I talked a lot about the Silmarillion. So if you're curious about the Silmarillion, there's episodes on the Forge of Tolkien to help you through all of that.
That's good stuff.
Yeah. Well, I hope so. I mean, my tech is better than I did when I was doing those. I've learned so many things in the last year about better OBS. My streaming, our Mosaic Arc live stream, right? I upped my tech. We got way far off of dragons, but see, this is one of the things that's been really fun about working on the stories that we've done. Is like they take you everywhere, right? And that's one of our, if you go to our website, the opening image is this. It's actually a design that's based on a ninth century manuscript of the planets in the zodiac and the arrangement on a particular date, often argued to be the day of creation, but it could be a date in 816 or something like that. That we are trying to show by way of all of our stories how all of these things connect constantly. So we've used that our sigil as this image of the internet that we are working in, of stories and symbols and references, and the kinds of things we've been talking about tonight with the way high culture and low culture connect, the way you know in poetry, it's both language arts and mathematical arts because you need number in order to make poetry, but also music and so forth. So all of these kind of connections are constantly there for us in our storytelling, which is the way scripture works, right? It's constantly self-referencing, self-referential.
Oh, yes.
I'm gonna ask you a selfish question on my part.
Mm.
How did you learn to write poetry? Because this is one thing that has always eluded me, the reading and writing of poetry. I'm working on a story right now, an adaptation of the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice,
Mm.
and I was so uncomfortable with the writing of poetry that I am working with a friend of mine who is a poet. Uh,
This is when
he's a
it
good.
comes out, everybody starts confessing to me eventually that they're writing narrative poetry and they've been too shy.
It's not, to be clear, the story is a novel. The story is a novel with poetry in it, so I'm not
Oh,
writing
okay. So oh,
full
good, like
narrative
Tolkien.
poetry.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, mhm. Yeah, in more, it's actually not that this is about my story, but it's more in the tradition of like Lewis's "Till We Have Faces" is
Okay.
the one of the main inspirations of it, which is an adaptation of Cupid and Psyche. Uh, but the point that I was getting is, how did you learn to write poetry? Because that's one thing, you can learn to write fiction by reading a lot of fiction and writing a lot, and even imitation is good. But with poetry, it's just never been something that I've been able to capture properly.
Well, that by what you just described for prose, right? And so with we did start with Stephen Fry's book and I was inspired by that and then I learned what some of what Stephen Fry's poems are about and I'm like, "Oh, maybe not that." So the thing is the what we're mainly writing in for Draco or for Dragon Common Room is iambic pentameter, and the reason it's worth really just working in that meter is that's what Shakespeare's written in, that's what Milton's written in, that's what Chaucer's written in. It's like the basic meter for English narrative, and we Alexander Pope wrote in it. I what I started with in the Dragon Common Room is I had well, one, I'd co-written a poem dragon song with a friend and we sort of started by showing people, let's talk through this poem and we'll talk about it. And then I said, okay, we're just going to write practice stanzas. And on the blog on Fancy Barrett Prayer, I posted a number of our sort of early like exercises, and Fry was actually good on this. He just said write poetry about anything, stop worrying about it being significant topics, and just work on feeling the meter, writing about anything. And I think one of my first poems in that exercise was about steak. Like, I gave everybody the exercise, write about food, steak, cows. I don't know. That we get caught up in writing poetry because you feel like it has to be significant or deep or this or that. You need to learn it as something that it has a form and a sound before worrying about the topic, which was Stephen Fry's point. And then we just started reading. I said, well, Alexander Pope is the greatest. I think it's fair to say he's the greatest writer of iambic pentameter. His line because a little learning is a dangerous thing, because that's in his essay on criticism. So I had us read that, and then I said, well, I've heard his Dunciad is kind of fun. Let's read that. And of course, the Dunciad is satire, and he's making fun of all journalists. And so then I said, well, let's write our own. And it's like we went through little steps like this, writing practice lines and doing exercises until I said we're going to write our very own Dunciad, and that's what Centrism Games is, our first book. Um, when we wrote Aurora Borealis, we said, well, we're going to write an adventure story, so we'll model it on the stanza form that Byron used in Don Juan, and we read some of that, practiced it, learned that. With Draco Chemicus, we're using the stanza form that Spencer invented. So it's we're imitating. That's You learn art by mimesis. You learn it by imitating. And then what's interesting about the poetry is if you're getting inside of the problem of it must fit this meter, and then you're going to make it read well so it doesn't feel complicated and clunky, and then you're going to make it rhyme, and then you're going to make it have meaning. One, it's slow and people are impatient, and two, if you're true to the craft, it will teach you. The poetry will teach you what you need to learn. which is it has been our experience.
Yeah, Pope I know almost entirely from his translation of the Iliad,
There
which
you
is
go.
mhm, which is I think well known at this point as less of a translation of the Iliad and more of Pope's rewrite of the Iliad into his poetic form. I don't even know the yeah, see, that's how little I know about poetry. That's why I grabbed
Well,
another poet.
it's
Uh,
it's it's been made into something that we have to be afraid of, which is interesting. And it's also the more we write, I think a lot people used to enjoy reading poetry because they actually trained in it as kids, right? It's like it was a basic practice of education to do practice verses. I think people don't like poetry now because they never practice writing it. And also because modernity has thrown out all of the verse forms, and so it's all like, throw words on a page and make them look, deep or significant. Modern non-metrical poetry is a catastrophe, bluntly.
yeah, it's
No problems from me. Though I
mhm.
have been hearing good things about Ezra Pound recently, and I'm wondering if I should read him. But that is neither here nor there.
I
Uh,
haven't read Pound, so I'm not sure. We did read some Joyce. We've been reading some Joyce for Draco Chemicus because he's kind of playful with language in ways that we're learning we have to be with the poem.
oh yeah, and even though James Joyce should be, you know, looked at askance for some things he's written, he was also of that generation that was still incredibly more educated than any of our peers. I can't believe that he came out of it a complete idiot, foaming at the mouth and spouting random words. Um,
Well, so I do we were get how long do we have on this podcast? But
Plenty
that
of time.
Finnegan's Wake is actually Marshall McLuhan taught me to appreciate Finnegan's Wake better. I enjoyed Ulysses, but I'd never gotten through the Wake. But that what Joyce was doing was prophetic of the internet. Do you think Joyce makes up words all the time? What are your avatars? What are memes? I mean, Joyce well, McLuhan is a like memester definitely, but Joyce is doing with language what people do on the internet constantly.
Yes. I would have to read him more to see that. But then again, I'm not as educated as I should be. Uh,
Nobody is. The
yeah.
I mean, it's like you read and I think that this is all of this. Joyce we think of as high culture, it's low culture. He's making jokes in pubs, right? Anthony Burgess did a really great video about Finnegan's Wake, and he does it in a pub. So the worst trick, I mean, you think the devil, the greatest trick the devil ever played was making people believe he didn't exist. The next worst is making everyone think that the great classics of the past were high culture.
Hmm.
Mhm. I mean, Shakespeare's the clearest of all examples, right? Like he was the popular playwright of the day, and but that's what I mean. Where you go, so that means he was pop. So there must have been like an elite class. No, he was the elite poet as well. He was both. He was for that's literally the famous quote of about Shakespeare was he was not for an age but for all time. Like you could also say he was for everyone. He was for high culture. He was for low culture. He was for kings. He was for peasants. Right.
Exactly.
It was just that separation is so new. Like it is so much newer than people think it is. Like it simply did not exist in the time of Shakespeare. You would not have like, oh, this is the high art and this is the low art. Like that's not how people thought. And if you think about it for more than a second too, it also just doesn't make sense. Right? Like why would you want to create something that only a select few group of people will enjoy and then pretend that that makes it better? Like
Well, that's kind of
it
modern art, right?
mhm, exactly.
Which is a horrible
One of
joke
the
and money laundering.
Yeah. One of the great, like, formative essays that I have read in my life is an essay by Tom Simon, who is the person who coined the term superversive, in a brilliant essay called Superversive from 2013. But that's not the essay that I'm thinking of. He wrote an essay that is on his website, bondwine.com, called Death by Bebop. And there's a companion essay that goes with it called Zombie Opera, but it's Death by Bebop I remember more, though Zombie Opera is probably equally good. Death by Bebop, I will not exaggerate to say, is probably one of like the most formative things that I've read in terms of how I think about culture. It's written in a style he calls a Smiggy McStudge essay, and think Screw Tape letters. It's like if Screw Tape were commenting on the culture, and I will give Simon some credit here in saying he's the only person I've ever seen imitate the Screw Tape style that sounds natural doing it. Uh, I've tried, I've failed. It's very difficult. But Simon does a very good job with it. It feels natural. So, like, Screw Tape comments on pop culture. And Death by Bebop is about the death of jazz. And it goes through what happened with jazz and how jazz eventually died. Like, in the modern day, jazz is for all intents and purposes dead. And you know something is dead, I think, when the attempts to revive it are all attempts to go back to a point that is decades earlier in its development. So that means that a roadblock was hit some point, like way, way earlier in the creation of the art form. And he says that there was a point where jazz originally is riffs on a theme, and you could do it with any type of music. It was common with classical music, right? You would play classical music, and then
Yes.
the game of jazz is how can you riff on this piece of music while still making it recognizable as that same piece of music. And the key to jazz is that jazz was fun. It was both fun for the musician and the audience.
Mhm.
People liked it, right? But then along came, and admittedly a genius, which Tom Simon admits in the essay, Dizzy Gillespie. Dizzy Gillespie creates bebop. So, what is bebop? Well, literally all bebop is are the variations of jazz, but without the head. So,
Mm.
you don't actually know what you're riffing off of. Now, if you're a genius like Dizzy Gillespie, your variations will be just as or more interesting than the head. The problem is that most people are not geniuses like Dizzy Gillespie. So bebop ultimately becomes almost unintelligible without the head, right? And it drastically fell in popularity until you get to the modern form of jazz that killed it, avant garde jazz. And that is
Mm.
where there isn't even an implied head. You're literally just making stuff up. And the only people who enjoy avant garde jazz are the musicians. The audience doesn't care. Why
Right.
would they? There's nothing
Right.
to enjoy about it. So, this parallel works really, really well with James Joyce. Ulysses is bebop, right? It's bebop. It is riffing off of a theme, the Odyssey, without the head. You know,
Mhm.
it's cheating when you write a book where you need to have another book alongside it in order to make sense of the book. And that is Ulysses. And Finnegan's Wake is avant-garde jazz. And that's why Finnegan's Wake is literally nonsense. Like the challenge with Finnegan's Wake, I think John C. Wright actually did this with a section of Ulysses.
Mm.
Is he goes, I'm gonna give you three things. Two of them were random generated words by an AI, and one is a quote from Ulysses.
Which one
Can
is
you
which?
guess? Yeah, can you guess which one is which? Uh, you can't. Like, you can't do it. This is modern art in a nutshell, right? Like, this is, which of these is paint that I spilled on a canvas, and which of these is a several $100,000 abstract painting? Uh, you can't tell. It's impossible to tell, and that's the point. You're not supposed to be able to tell. Uh, because ultimately it's an act of destruction, and that's what the superversive is fighting against, right? Uh, it's an act of an attempt to destroy an art form. I think the nicest thing that I'm willing to say about James Joyce, Ulysses, and Finnegan's Wake is that I think, unlike with jazz, they failed. more or less in what they did. The novel lasted for quite, at the very least, if you want to say that the novel has collapsed today because of the publishing industry, maybe I'll hear that argument out. But I don't think that it was Finnegan's Wake and Ulysses that destroyed it. I think that they tried, though. I think that they certainly made inroads on the way that critics thought. But I have no love for James Joyce. I have no appreciation for James Joyce, and I recognize too that James Joyce is in fact exceptionally talented, even a genius, and that just makes it that much worse. You know, you've used your powers for the forces of evil, uh, right? Like a supervillain. Picasso is the same way, where
Well,
Picasso,
okay,
like,
so it's like I'm feeling protective of Joyce, but I'm not going to go there because not my hill right now. But I mean, what happened was Tolkien, right? And you could say, Tolkien, the Lord of the Rings regularly wins those Waterston prize. Well, the ones that they used to run in the late 20th century, right? That he's what's your favorite
yeah,
book of the 20th century, and it's always the Lord of the Rings. So, but the Lord of the Rings is not a novel. The novel is a 19th century form of a particular kind of atmosphere and character and social realist, right? I don't actually there's not many. I like Jane Austen, but I don't like that many novels, like classic novels, maybe Dumas, but those are adventures because they're in fact secular and there's no Christ in them. There's my sort of list of modern literature that I'm very appreciative of John C. Wright's books now because like you can read it and there's actually Christ in the story.
yeah,
Modern
there are
novels, it's
exceptions,
like
but for the most
Middlemarch.
part,
George Eliot wrote Middlemarch when she finished translating David Friedrich Strauss's Life of Christ Critically Considered, which basically said it's all, it can't be history, it's all myth. And then he went back and wrote, no, it is, well, whatever. But, her Middlemarch is the sort of the self-destruction of the Anglican theologian. I think I'm not going to blame Joyce for that. That's the novel. I think the novel was self-destructive to begin with in its sense that it wasn't going to include God.
um, I would say you're correct in that sense. There are it depends on what you count as a novel then too, right? Like the historical development of it, There are things that I've seen lists count as novels that I go, come on, that's not a novel.
Mm.
Like people put the Tale of Genji onto like the earliest novel, and I'm like, come on, that's not a novel.
Well, yeah, they're
Uh,
always trying to put things into the category because they like the category and they want to elevate it.
mhm.
And then they'll say Tolkien is, the Lord of the Rings is not a novel, which I just did say, but more because I say the novel is, it's, so I have a riff in a lecture I gave a few years ago to some academics, and I was going on about the Enlightenment and Steven Pinker's argument in Enlightenment Now about maybe it's better angels or in nature, how modernity discovers empathy and self-reflection because of the novel. And I'm like, yeah, your own book undermines that argument because you can see both empathy in the kinds of things that I study for the Middle Ages, and learning by learning other people's points of view from meditation, again, in the kinds of things I study long before the novel comes out. And modernity has been anti-Christian, flat out, we'll just say it. The novel participates in that anti-Christian mode, and it takes place primarily in a secular world. The novel doesn't really know how to deal with the transcendent. Poetry does, right? All great, the great ancient literature about the gods is in verse.
Yeah, I've also
Poetry is the
seen.
most superversive thing we can write. There, I said
You're actually right. I
it.
actually completely unironically agree with that because I there was something I read a while ago that points out that that's like one of the main forms of language used in the Bible. In fact, I think they say it's arguably the most common form of language used in the Bible is poetry.
Right.
Uh,
Well, the Psalms, the prophecies, yeah.
I forget how it did this analysis. I would need to find the article, but it makes the point that whether it is the most common or not, like it is an integral part of the biblical mode of speaking is poetic.
Right.
Uh, but going, I'm curious what you think of this, since I know that this is not on the topic of what is it, the Dragon? I just
Draco
blanked on the name
Uncle.
of your thing. I'm so sorry.
Well, the Dragon
Dragon
Common
Common
Room is
Room.
the
Yeah,
group and the
thank you.
practice, and the
Yes,
Draco
Dragon Common
Chimicus.
Room.
Yeah,
Wow,
Draco Chimicus is the story.
I blanked. I'm sorry. But anyway, but I'm
It's the
curious
Joyce
what you.
effect.
Yeah, exactly. Uh, I'm curious what you think of this. I've seen this argument before, and I've gone back and forth on how convinced I was of it. That the Lord of the Rings was, in fact, an extremely modern sort of story that actually was written in a very modern style, but that Tolkien mastered at a level greater than the modernists. In the sense of this, that The Lord of the Rings is exceptionally realist in character motivations, in the setting, in the intense level of detail, but that in the realism of people like, moderns, even like Cormac McCarthy, who traveled to, his locations for years and did this, but Tolkien mastered that level of realism at an even greater level than the moderns ever did, and essentially perfected the form that they claim to like. And that's one of the reasons, because I have talked to people who are in like, so the Superversives came up, little history lesson, alongside another group called the Pulp Revolution, which we are in favor of too, right? Like, going back to the pulps. So I think Ben is as well. Like, we're definitely
Mm-hmm.
in favor of the pulps. But we were not an identical group, and there was, in the early days, some I don't know, infighting sounds a little bit harsh. I don't know if that's the word. Maybe discussion back and forth would be a better way to put it. And one of the things was that, like, they did not really like Tolkien, and they said that, and the reason that they disliked
Oh, them's
Tolkien.
fighting words. I will go on that hill.
Mhm. Well, the reason, it wasn't so much that they had a specific problem with anything written in the Lord of the Rings, but they said that Tolkien is one of the people that killed the pulps. That he wrote in that modernist style that was
Mm.
very realist, and that ended up dominating fantasy literature, and that pushed out the pulps. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that idea. I have gone back and forth on it. I defended Tolkien generally, because there was a criticism that, like, Tolkien was, somebody made the implication that Tolkien might have altered some of the writing, because some of his writing to appeal to his high class college professors. And I said, like, in Oxford, and I said that's complete nonsense.
That's
That
total nonsense.
Yeah, uh,
That's ridiculous.
it
So,
also
but
it's
but
so
but
out of character for Tolkien to do.
he wouldn't have done that. No,
Mhm.
but so I think that um, Tom, if you know Tom Shippey's book, Author of the Century, he he Shippey himself is an Anglo-Saxon scholar, and he makes a very good case for Tolkien as both, it's like writing in this medieval style, but also modern. And when I in my class that I teach at University of Chicago on Tolkien, it's Tolkien medieval and modern, right? And he's both this quintessential modern response to World War One, right? Like Lewis and some of the other, Orwell. Shippey did a really nice essay showing that all of these authors are coming out of the experience of the First World War, so they are quintessentially modern, trying to deal. Gondolin, right? I did that last episode that I did for the Forge of Tolkien was all about the Gondolin story is one that it lurks behind all of Tolkien's fiction. It's there, and it's mentioned in The Hobbit as the Goblin Wars, where the swords that the Hobbit has come from. It's referenced constantly in The Lord of the Rings, but Tolkien only wrote it once because it's actually a absolutely terrifying account of being under siege by basically tanks, or in the one of the Avengers movies when all the buggy things come out of the sky as spaceships that look sort of sinuous and um beetle like, they're like millipedes or something. The tanks in the Gondolin description are like that. They're like these dragons with um the sort of uh wheels that the World War One tanks have, right? Uh,
Dreads.
yeah, like that. So and the city's destroyed, right? And so that Tolkien, just like Lewis, is they're haunted by what they saw in the trenches. That's clear in the Mordor account, but it's also clear in the way he doesn't write about war. He never there's except for Gondolin, he basically never writes true battle scenes. If you read them, they're frustrating because nothing you can't really. It's like Jackson, to make them into movies, had to imagine a lot of that action because it's not in the book. It's left kind of projected and you know
There's a
um
Yeah, there's a fantastic website that goes through the battle scenes in the Lord of the Rings in both the movie and the book,
mm,
and like analyzes if it would be if the battle scenes are plausible from both a tactical and logistic perspective. And the conclusion that they came to is that the movies, they said, and this is some things Jackson did were probably just straight up mistakes, but for the most part, they were contractions to make it visually, appealing.
right.
And but that the books, they said, are like insane, which makes sense to me knowing Tolkien, right? That the level of detail in terms of the accuracy of the tactics, strategies, logistics of the armies are like insanely accurate. Like
That
that.
may be, but there's no action. And if you, I mean, it's like, okay, this the horses charge or something like that. But if you read like the Battle of Helm's Deep, Anduril does it all. It's the sword is sort of it's very interesting if you're actually trying to imagine the warriors fighting. There's not real. I'm a fencer. I it's like when I'm reading this, there's no action. It may be logistically structurally accurate, but Tolkien didn't describe battle at
Mhm.
the sort of fisticuffs level of exactly who hits who.
Yeah, I think that Tolkien, one of the most famous lines of the Lord of the Rings, right, is Faramir. I don't love the sword for its. I love not the sword for its sharpness, or the arrow for its swiftness. I love only that which they defend.
Hmm.
And I think that there is a sense where I sort of agree with the cult people, and I think, and I don't know how intentional this is from Tolkien that he was be responding to I think of Conan the Barbarian immediately, right, when I hear that line, and I also think, for that matter, of somebody like George R. R. Martin. And what fascinates me is that Tolkien is somebody who I think perfectly understood. Like, Tolkien went to World War One, where his friends died around him, one of the most brutal wars of all time, and he was on some of the most difficult fighting in that war. So he knew how bad war was, but he never makes the mistake of a George R. R. Martin who wants to portray who was a draft dodger, by the way, who
Mm,
to portray all of the ugliness of war, to make the point of how bad war is and be like, this is why we shouldn't have war. Well, Tolkien knew more than Martin ever possibly could
right.
from firsthand experience. But Tolkien also says, and yet there is a point where war is necessary. But why is war necessary? It is horrible. It's not necessary for its own sake. It's necessary for the sake of defending the really important things.
Right.
Uh, I think you also see this a little bit in the Iliad. Uh, we had a discussion on this. I think, was it last week? Right? Yeah. Me and Ben had a discussion on this last week on Hector in the Iliad, and one thing that always moved me a lot about the final line of the Iliad is Hector's description is the breaker of horses.
Mm,
The final line of the Iliad is, so they buried Hector, breaker of horses. And I think that the Iliad is also hitting that same balance that Tolkien hits, that there is a glory to war, a very real, legitimate one, but ultimately it does not outweigh the horror of it,
hmm.
in the sense of but that doesn't mean it's not sometimes necessary. And the death of Hector is not the death of Hector the warrior, it's the death of Hector the breaker of horses, right? Like, this is what Hector would have been. Uh, it just really it's always been something with Tolkien that really moved me, that he went through World War One, and he went through this vicious fighting, and he came out of it less cynical than a man like Martin, who refused to fight.
Right. Yeah. So I don't. You were asking about, it's like, does the criticism about Tolkien mean, I think the problem is he worked on it so hard and rewrote it so many times. So the pulps are famously quickly written.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think you're accusing someone who one is accusing someone who trained himself to be perfect in his craft for doing it too well, frankly. Right. And if Tolkien rewrites the same story for 50 years, yeah, it's going to be better than something you wrote in 6 months.
Yeah, that's true. Uh, One other thing I saw that this was a great description of Tolkien, where they go like, "Why does Tolkien, end with a happy ending all in all of his story?" Then somebody goes like, "So he does in the Lord of the Rings." I know that people like, "Oh, it's a very bittersweet ending," and it is, but I would classify it as ultimately happy. Uh, Maybe I'm in the minority. I don't know,
Of course, it
but
is. Sam gets married and has lots of kids.
yeah, exactly. It is bittersweet though. And The Hobbit has a happy ending. And somebody goes, "You want to know?" He goes, "You want to know the real truth that people don't tell you?" He said Tolkien hated happy endings and almost never wrote them. In fact, in his Legendarium, they said like the Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit are two of the only stories with happy endings. The only other one that I could think of off the top of my head is Berwyn and Luthien, which I guess has a happy ending. Uh, Fundamentally, and I think that it's important that Tolkien gave it a happy ending since he saw him and his wife as Berwyn and Luthien. So I think it meant something to him to make sure that they sort of ended up, all right. But yeah,
Yes, and then and
Tolkien.
then you have to read letter 43 that he wrote to his son Michael about how hard it was for him and Edith. So no, it's like I have one of my lectures for the Tolkien class is how many endings there are of the Lord of the Rings. It's like so there's well Sam says well I'm back, but then there's the ending at the beginning in the preface when Celeborn is the last of the living the last of the living memory to leave Middle Earth, and then there's and it's like is the ending when Arwen passes away, right? Or it's like there's a bunch of endings in the Lord of the Rings. They're scattered all over the place.
Hmm.
And if you take
Yeah,
Sam's "Well, I'm back," yeah, that's the happy ending, but you always cry at that point because it's
I
and
had a
told what
professor from
told
a myth and culture class who
yeah.
used to say that that was what she thought one of the saddest lines in literature was when Sam says, "Well, I'm back," when he gets back to the Shire.
Mhm. I think it but Tolkien understands sorrow as, it's swords it's like oh golly I'm seeing the line when this is one of my favorite passages and I should remember it always when in the field of Cormallen they're listening to the minstrel sing the song of Frodo of the Nine Fingers and they weep because it's so beautiful but it's also sorrowful that for Tolkien that was beauty is sorrow with joy. It's Christian. Like you don't look at a cross like something uncomplicated.
Hmm. Yeah, there's because you go like Sam lives his life, and I know that he probably in the stories he probably ends up in the Undying Lands eventually. I think I don't remember if he says it directly, but he heavily implies that this is going to happen with Sam as well eventually. Uh, but even that, it's like you don't really know what that means. Like Frodo is going to recover in the Undying Lands, which like okay, how? What Tolkien doesn't say. You don't really even know what the Undying Lands are like. And there's
There's
also this
hold
interesting
on,
thing in
stop,
Tolkien that
hold on,
it's
hold on, hold on, hold on. To any Christian, we know what the undying lands are going to be like, and we know the healing we will receive from our sin and shame in heaven. Whether you take the long way or the short way, depending on which side of the Catholic Protestant aisle you're on, you know that as we enter into heaven, we are removed from our sin natures. They are no longer there. The old man is finally taken out of our soul, the dead old man, that is. It's the same way with it's the same sort of metaphor here. Frodo, not that I'm saying that sin nature is the same thing in Lord of the Rings, but the damage and poison that Frodo received, which pained him throughout his life every year on the date, is removed. In the same way the goading of sin is removed, the goading of Shelob. And as an Ungoliant respecter, it's important that, we don't bring spiders into heaven. I would like that personally. Uh,
Well, okay, what I was thinking as both of you are talking is this. So this is why story teaches us things that proposition doesn't. Right? We
mm,
wrestle with the meaning of the stories, and that is. I read there's a new book that came out a couple of years ago, and the Return of the King basically is a giant parable.
mm-hmm,
And I think that of all of the things, like saying what mode, what genre was Tolkien writing in, it's this one. It's parable. It's the teaching story, the
mm,
mystery that makes you wrestle with it.
absolutely.
Mm-hmm. There's another thing in Lord of the Rings as well, where Tolkien, I forget what he refers to it, but the mortality of man is referred to as a gift repeatedly in Tolkien's works. I want to say like the gift of Mandos, but I might be wrong about that name. Uh,
Gift of Iluvatar. It's the gift of
yeah,
Iluvatar.
yeah, I think you're right. But it's referred to as a gift, but again, it's something that like Tolkien in the story never really explains why it's a gift, but it is assumed to be a gift. Uh, and I think that that's fascinating because I think that that's another point where, like Ben is saying, you sort of need to assume to make sense of it. You almost need to assume Christianity, right? Like,
Oh, and Tolkien said that. I mean, he said it's a Christian story. But it's what I'm saying. It's like when we're thinking about genre and the problem of how well, one, how we write, but also why some stories seem to touch us at a different level than others. And you're saying it's like modern novels don't have this transcendence. And Tolkien, whether he's explicitly making, he won't talk about Christ explicitly because it's all supposed to be pre-Christian. Um, that he does it from the perspective of someone who believes that you know believes in the Trinity and believes that the gospel is truth. And you feel that. I mean, and that's why I've enjoyed. I need to read more of John C. Wright's. I've mainly just read the Swan Knight and the follow up, the second one in that series. But I can feel that in his books. That
mm-hmm.
you're in the story that carries truth, and that is it knows that is the truth. And it's interesting. So sort of meta level, it's interesting how hard that is to write in a modern context. How hard it is to write truly Christian stories
Mm-hmm.
now. And that's one of the things we say with Aurora Borealis or Draco Chemicus, that we're trying to write in a medieval mode where the reality of Christ is a feature of the story, whether it's made overt in the story or not. That in Aurora Borealis, the Christ figure is the aurora, it's the griffin that they see displayed in the south, but they also encounter as a griffin. And in Draco Chemicus, it's there's a character that is a Christ character, but he has to have his own sense of reality as a character in the story. Otherwise, it's not going to indeed demonstrate the problem of the incarnation. It's like, what was it like just to have me talking to Jesus? And one of my great literary models is Dorothy Sayers, who was
Yeah.
no knew Tolkien and wrote a play for radio play of
Mm-hmm.
Christ, which I recently learned was the first that had been performed in English since the 17th century. Right, they weren't allowed. There was law that said they couldn't portray Jesus in fictional stage form, no
That's
play.
interesting.
Yeah, so when her radio play came out, there was like huge debate, right? It's like, could you do this, and did she destroy this, and then now since then, since her play, we've had the movies and the rock opera and yet more movies and things like that. But her radio play was actually the first in several hundred years.
Yeah, the one thing about our stories is that when we do Pinkerton's Ghosts, our story is in a it's about like supernatural detectives who are hunting like monsters and things like that.
Hmm.
Very supernatural, but unlike Supernatural, which is a complete hodgepodge of whatever they thought would be cool for today to add to their mythology. Uh, we have a, and by the way, I'm not even necessarily like bashing Supernatural, which I've watched almost none of. I just know that that is the case.
I have
But
I've heard of it. I think Vox
yeah,
talked about it once.
but uh, in Pinkerton's Ghost, one of the key things that we sort of all agreed on very early on in the show is it takes place in a Christian background. And
Mm.
because we have a mix of Christian traditions among me, Ben, and our third writer, Ken, the three writers, we agreed that we were going to use the C.S. Lewis Mere Christian as the basis for our background.
Okay.
And uh, my character in the story is a Catholic, and that's a big part of the story, and a big part of how he interacts with the world is that he is a Catholic. And this fundamentally changes how he deals with various things, what he considers moral and immoral. Uh, and it's the same with Ben's character and with Ken's character that they like we have magic in the stories and magic artifacts in the stories, and one thing that we're clear on in the story is that even though we will sometimes use magic, magic is wrong, right? It involves
Right.
a cost on the soul, when you use it. And the I know that the classical Catholic response to is magic real is technically speaking it does not matter because even by attempting to use magic you are sinning.
Hmm.
And I think that that's a good answer, right? Like I do think that should kind of just give you the answer, right? It's like well, is magic real? Who cares? Don't do it.
Right.
Uh,
Right.
but in a world where this is a fictional world, we're just assuming that all of this stuff works exactly as advertised, right? But it takes a cost on the soul. And you're right, though, that it's interesting that, like, we had to make a conscious decision to do this. Like, we had to consciously sit down and go, this is going to take place in a Christian cosmology, right?
Right.
Heaven exists, hell exists, Jesus Christ rose from the dead, and that is the world that the story takes place in. And most things that you read nowadays just don't want to talk about this. And it's funny too because like that's not the main story of Pinkerton's Ghost. It's not a Christian story, right? Like
Right.
in the sense that we are not telling a tale that is moralizing. It just takes place in a world where Christianity is true. And by stories not having that, it's weird to say this, but you're losing so much of our cultural heritage.
Right. But you're also losing the truth, but
Mm.
right.
You are, but I do think that there are other like cosmologies and things like for example,
How
there are
can there be
stories I
multiple
like.
cosmologies? It's like there's
No,
multiple
not correct.
realities.
Oh, that's not what I mean. Yeah, that is not at all what I mean. To be clear, there is one truth. I will say it publicly now, right on the air. Pass the witch test. Jesus Christ is Lord. But
Very good. Just so we're
but
clear.
yes. What I mean is, from a fictional perspective, I do think that you could write a story where you can assume that another cosmology is true. You see this in the East commonly, uh, right? But it's I think when you're writing a story for you're losing the Western cultural heritage in losing Christianity. So I mean that even outside of the perspective of also I think that that Christianity is
Right.
true. Like even further, you're neutering yourself. You're you're neutering that cultural heritage. There's fantasy stories that I greatly enjoy that are like uh, I'm trying to think of an example off the top of my head. Oh, here's a good one. Uh, in certain anime, they assume things like animism or Shintoism,
Right.
right?
Right.
Now, I don't think that they're correct in the same. At the very least, I don't think they're correct in the way Christians are correct. I do think that gods can exist per se in the form of like fallen angels or things like that, or even angels for that matter. I think Augustine theorized that some gods might even be angels, and this was he was only theorizing. He was just kind of spitballing, but he said like it's possible maybe, but uh, so while I don't think that they're right in the same sense that Christians are right, I do think at least that they're drawing on a real cultural heritage, but this is the problem with a lot of modern media. Like the new Indiana Jones is a really, really good example of this,
Mm-hmm.
where Indiana Jones was a riff of 30 serials, and 30 serials were constantly delving into, like, our Christian cultural heritage. So the original Indiana Jones films do that. The first film is the Ark of the Covenant. The third film is the Holy Grail. The second film, they travel to India and they take out evil Hindu cultists, right? Uh, Very explicitly evil Hindu cultists. Now, I don't think the film says that all Hindus are evil, but it is a note that in this case the cultists are Hindu, uh,
Well, they're
and
thuggies.
then
They're thuggies. They're
something like that.
They're Kali
It's been a
thuggies.
while since I saw
Yeah.
Temple of Doom, but
A
in
legitimate problem in uh,
mm, yes,
India at the time.
you're
Right.
correct. As all lovers of Around the World in 80 Days now. But anyway, when you get to Dial of Destiny in this modern movie, now of course I have not seen it and will not see it. I say of course to be like no, you shouldn't be paying to see this movie. But my
We've all read the
understanding
Dark Herald's review so that we don't have to go watch it.
exactly.
Yes.
Uh, but my understanding of the film and is that it's now like a science fiction device. So they have completely lost the entire cultural milieu of like Indiana Jones. And for that matter, they did in that fourth movie too, where it was aliens for some reason.
With the
Uh,
crystal skulls, yes.
yeah, terrible movie. Uh, Terrible movie in its own right. And like it was aliens, and now it's like some sci-fi time travel device. And Indiana Jones, he
Well,
makes a
it's
comment.
actually no, it's like the Dial of Destiny. I actually know about that. It's the Ankathera something. There is this ancient Hellenistic clock, and that's apparently what
Yeah,
it is. Yeah,
it's a
but it
calendar clock thing,
yeah,
though. I
but it's
know
a
the
real
one.
thing.
It
Yeah.
It's
is,
yeah,
but
yeah,
it's like a time travel device in the movie.
right.
Uh,
Well,
yeah,
time travel they don't necessarily do well with the.
mm,
I don't know. I've only read Dark Herald's reviews
yes.
of it. Yes, so
The incidentally, the real Ankathera is itself like a really fascinating object in its own
right.
right.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
don't mean to by saying well it's only a calendar like that's not quite fair. Like it's an extremely fascinating like essentially I've seen it described as a primitive computer and that the discovery of the Ankathera actually like overturned a lot of ideas of like how advanced the Greeks were
Precisely.
because
Yeah.
yeah
Yeah.
it should have
It's a
been
real and fascinating historical artifact. So, unlike the crystal skulls, which I'm not sure are real. I
What?
don't know about that.
yeah it's
The Holy Grail. I'm sorry to tell you. Probably didn't exist. Not in the way that
well
they imagine it in the story. For reasons that I can, if we, we've been going on a long time, and I think I'm obliged to make dinner soon. So
that's okay because
okay.
we traditionally stop at 9 and we're at 8:59 so it all
So,
works out.
Oh,
all
good.
right.
Okay.
Well, uh, we have ranged far afield, and even I can't bring us back. You have stumped me, Dr. Brown. Usually I can bring anything into anything, but I cannot.
Ha ha! You need to train in poetry. We do this daily.
No. But I do see that you have a new season of Mosaic Art coming out in August, and you have many other projects that I will be sure to contact you over when they are ready to bring forth into the world.
I'm happy to do it. And think I'm the thing is that this has been a lot of fun ranging around. This is precisely what we hope happens when people start reading our stories. It's like they're just starting points
Oh
that
yes.
take you on journeys. Yeah.
There's much for us to discuss. Uh, when people say we are children of the winter, we can certainly swap tales around the bonfire. Uh, Thank you for joining us, Dr. Brown. Thank you again, Anthony, for always being there. And thank you to our many listeners.
Fine.
Uh,
Thank you for having me. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Are we off the air then?
Yep.
Yeah.